Hello friends, today we are going to discuss the section 5 of the Transfer of Property Act 1882. And before we start discussing the provisions of this act, it's very important to understand the historical background and the circumstances that lead this enactment. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1957, in Bengali call it Sepoy Bidroh, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. And this is marked as a turning point of Indian history and lead this transfer of the administrative control from the East India Company to the British Crown. The legal and admin reformation post this 1857 mutiny. So, the following this Sipan mutiny of 1957, the British Parliament abolished the administrative authority of the East India Company through their Queen's Proclamation in 1858 and assumed the direct control over India. Subsequently, there are several laws were enacted, including the Indian Penal Code 1860, the Indian Contract Act 1872, and the Indian Evidence Act in 1872. So, in 1857, the transfer of admin power from the East India Company to the British Crown. And then 1858, the proclamation of the Crown Rule. Indian administrations were brought directly under the British Parliament. Then, post that, in 1860, the Indian Penal Code systematic reformation led to the passing of IPC, and then in 1872, Contract and Evidence Act enacted. And the legal, if we talk about the legal landscape prior to this 1882 Transfer Property Act. So prior to this TP Act 1882, the transfer of the movable property was regulated under Indian Contract Act 1872. And the transfer of the immovable property was governed by the Hindu law, Mohammedan law, and CPC as well. Okay. However, there was no comprehensive legislation governing the transfer of the immovable property made by a act of the parties. So, the absence of this statutory law, Anglo-Indian court rely on the principle of the justice, equity, and good consequences, leading to inconsistency of decisions, occasions of injustice due to difference between the English and Indian social conditions. So, before this Transfer Property Act got enacted in 1882, so this was the problem, pertaining to the transfer of specifically Transfer of Property Act by the parties. So then in 1882, the Transfer Property Act got enacted, and then as per the Section 5, if you see the definition, the transfer of property is an act by which a living person conveys property at present or in future to one or more living person or to himself. So this is the definition of Section 5, and this Section 5 essentially need there are seven conditions to fulfill. Okay, so first is transfer property is an act, then must be a living person who is a transferor, then there should be a conveyance, we call it deed of conveyance, and then property must be a property, then the timing, it should be at present or in future, then transferee, there should be one or more living person as a transferee, and then property can be also transferred to himself as well. So we'll talk about in details in the next few slides. So condition one, or the requirement one, is the transfer of property as an act. Is the transfer property is an act where the parties are required to do something. Okay, and then unlike inheritance or testamentary transfer, here the parties must enter into an agreement. There must be a valid agreement before a property transfer, and then the parties are also required to fulfill certain formalities to ensure the property is legally transferred. And the legal distinction, if we talk about the distinguish the Transfer of the Property Act from law governing the operation of law of successions. Now, the requirement two is the living person as a transferor. So the transferor must be a living person, as must be a living person or in the existence of the date of the transfer. The legal status should be both the transferor, both a natural person, a human being, or be a jurisdiction person, a company, or corporations. The regulation complies the transferor must fulfill the conditions as written in the Indian Contract Act 1872, and the essential qualification would be the transferor must be attend the majority and be a sane person and have the title to transfer the property. Is very important. The property should be clear title, and the transferor must be the owner of that property. He should have the title to transfer the property. The required number three, the concept of conveyance. The word convey implies the creation of a new title or an interest of the property in favor of the transferee by the transferor. So that is the meaning of the conveyance. And transaction assessment, one must determine the conveyancing act of taking place to validate the transaction. The transaction assessment is very important. And then the definition, the conveying the implies creating a new title or interest in the property in favor of the transferee. Then transfer of the property, the presence of the conveyancing act result a formal transfer of the property interest. And then transactional example is that common forms of include absolute transfer where sale and gift in case of sale and gift, and the partial interest transaction in case of lease or mortgage. So these are the requirement, the concept of conveyance. And requirement number four is the definition or existence of the property. The word property implies the corporal as well as the incorporeal property. It is also include a movable. It is also include a movable or immovable property. There must be a absolute transfer of the property, sale or gift, or in which all the interest of the property are being transferred, or it may be a transfer of the personal interest of the property in case of lease and mortgage. However, the property must be existing the date of transfer. It must not be a future property. So it's very important. The property must be exist in the date of the transfer. And then here the property types which we have already discussed: corporeal, incorporeal, movable, immovable property, and transfer type would be absolute and as well as the personal interest. Requirement number five is one or more percent of the transfer. So this requirement is basically for the transferee. So the transferee is the person who received the property. The transferee must be a living person at the time of the transfer. The transferee may be a natural person, a human being, or maybe a jurisdiction person, a company, corporal, or society. The transferee need not to be a competent to the contract. Means transferee may not be a minor. The transferee may be a minor or a person of unsound mind. So a minor or insane person can also receive a property, especially for the case of gift. Okay. Then the last two requirements are requirement 6 and 7, which talks about the timing and the self transfer provisions. So at the property can be transferred at present, which is the transfer of the property can take place immediately, or maybe the date of transfer would be in future. So that is the timing. And in the second, the explicitly includes the act of living person conveying the property to himself. So this is also possible. So these were the seven requirement as per the section 5 of the Transfer Property Act 1882. I hope and this was a informative video. And in case you have any query on this section 5 of Transfer Property Act, you can write back to us. Also, if you need the slide decks of this presentation, you can share your email address. This PPT will be shared to your email address directly. Thank you. Thank you for watching.